Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we talk about why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized, and we try and talk about solutions on every show. No sense talking about it if you don't have ideas about how you're going to fix it. I know you've heard me say over and over again that my biggest concern, or the biggest reason I think it's so dysfunctional, is what I call incumbency protection. The same people not only keep getting elected, but they fix the system so they can keep getting elected. And there's four prongs to this theory. It's the campaign finance, it's the redistricting, voting rights, and ballot access. To a certain extent, we've beaten three of the horses to death already, but we'll keep beating them. But we've never had a chance to talk about voting rights, and I'm very excited today. It is the Aspen Ideas Fest time of the year, and I've combed their roster, and I found one of the nation's leading experts on voting rights, and she said yes. So other than my wife saying yes, this is the biggest yes I've had in a long time. So we're talking about voting rights today, but it's very important because if you can't get to the poll and you can't vote and you can't express your choice, that's not the way our system's supposed to be working. It's not the democratic system. And when elected officials go out of their way to try and prevent people from coming to the polls to vote, to me that's one of the worst crimes. I'm going to use the word crime. There's one of the worst crimes in our democratic system. So voting rights is essential. Got a great guest today, Mimi Marziani. Come on.
I say Marziani, but my husband's Italian relative.
Mimi Marziani from the Texas Civil Rights Project, and without a doubt, one of the nation's leading experts on voting rights. So Mimi, however you say your last name, welcome to the show.
Great, pleasure to be here.
So I just accuse you of being one of the nation's leading experts in voting rights, and I think you are. Tell us a little bit about how you got there.
Absolutely. So as you noted, I'm currently the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. We are Texas Lawyers for Texas Communities. We focus on a couple of big thorny issues, and voting rights is one of them. And voting rights also happens to be my particular area of expertise in my career. I have spent, I guess most notably in this category, several years at a place called the Brennan Center for Justice in New York, where I did voting rights, campaign finance, and a bit of work on dysfunction in the U.S. Senate. So it sounds like it's right up your alley. I also...
But you didn't solve anything. That's why we're talking today.
I did not solve anything. I admit that.
Maybe a couple little things,
yeah. Right? When I moved to Texas, I moved to be in-house counsel for Wendy Davis when she ran for governor of Texas in 2014. And then I worked for a political group called Battleground Texas before stepping into this role. So not only do I have a deep constitutional knowledge of voting rights, I think I also bring a very unique perspective in having been on the front line, both in a political campaign with a political group and now in my current position. One of the things, we'll talk more about our work at TCRP, but one of the things we do is frequently represent community organizations that are trying to get the voice out of everyday people, rattle the cages a little bit, and turn people out to vote. And so we see firsthand some of the barriers they face.
No, I saw from your resume you have argued before the U.S. Supreme Court, which is very impressive.
I have not personally argued.
Oh, you haven't personally argued. Oh, you're part of a team?
Yes, I've been part of teams on cases that have gone to the Supreme Court.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anything famous? Any?
Well, I guess most
they're all
notably, yeah. I worked on a case in 2011 where we were trying to defend a public financing system out of Arizona. This was enacted by Citizen Ballot Initiative. The point, it sounds like you're going to be fairly simpatico here, the point was to try to get private money out of the electoral system and most importantly, actually give challengers a chance to actually step up and run for office, even if they didn't have deep pockets or had deep-pocketed friends. Unfortunately, we were not wholly successful in that case, although I personally, and this will be a topic for another day, am a deep believer in public financing systems that do boost competition, which is really important.
Well, that had to be fascinating to be part of a team going to the U.S. Supreme Court. That would have to be awesome.
Absolutely.
So I do want to get to voting rights, but give us your spiel on Texas Civil Rights Project. Tell us what you do and why you wake up every day and look forward to going to work.
You know, I do wake up every day and look forward to going to work. I'm not going to claim it's easy fighting for civil rights in Texas, but I find it extraordinarily meaningful, and I'm really lucky to have a great team with me. As I mentioned, we work on issues other than voting rights that I won't touch on, namely criminal justice reform and a big anti-discrimination bucket that we call advancing racial and economic justice. Under our voting rights bucket, however, we are involved in a number of projects. One is working with our community partners. We have become very concerned that the folks who are registered to vote in Texas, and obviously before you can vote, you have to be registered to vote, first step. But the folks who are registered to vote in Texas don't look a lot like the general population in Texas. Our electorate is older and whiter and richer than the rest of us. And because Texas, everything is always bigger in Texas, that translates to literally millions of people right now who can't cast a ballot that counts because of their voter registration status. And that's been one big issue that we've been trying to tackle. And one tactic is by bringing lawsuits against government agencies that are supposed to register people to vote and aren't. So we can come back to that.
So you're trying to get them to do their job?
Trying to
like
get them to do their
mandamus
job.
action or something? Or
Yes,
whatever? Okay.
yes. And in addition, another big part of our program, as I mentioned before, is providing support to our community groups. And these are the types of groups that are out there every day, you know, knocking on doors in neighborhoods, helping people get organized, and to a point you made before, you know, making sure that elected officials are accountable to their people, no matter what party those elected officials are. Unfortunately, a variety of laws have made it very, very hard to do that sort of organizing work in Texas, and so we're really proud to represent those groups. A third bucket of work is defensive and fighting back against measures, including some really unfortunate ones we've seen recently, of lawmakers trying to suppress voting and civic engagement. And then finally, the last bucket is going on the offensive a little bit and trying to get creative, especially at the local level, and figure out, you know, how can we make voting and voter registration easier, and how can we boost participation by making some changes locally?
Now, you're doing most of your work in Texas, but you've been in other states. One of the things we've talked about other shows is that I think we have the most what's called trifectas across the country, where the governors and the legislatures are solidly one party. We've never had this many before.
Right, that's right.
And
that's true.
I think trifecta scenarios give more opportunity for nuisance than anything else. So do you, I don't know enough about Texas, though. Is it currently a trifecta?
Yes.
Republican governor, Republican legislature?
Yes, and it has been since at least 2002.
Okay, so it's a long time.
Yeah.
And again, going back to my theory of incumbency protection, these people actually want to stay in office.
That's right.
They think they need to stay in office. So one of the ways they're going to do it is they're going to try and find laws to suppress the voting in a way that'll benefit them.
It's true. I mean, I will say the truest thing about power is people tend to like to keep it.
Yeah, they do.
And I'm with you that I find it, you know, just offensive to my core, the notion that you would manipulate the laws of the election in order to stay in power. Obviously, what our Constitution contemplates is that you get in power by having the best ideas. That's why the First Amendment has such robust protections, both for speech, but also for protest and for organizing and for lobbying your government. And unfortunately, if one is able to manipulate the system, you throw that entire carefully crafted system off kilter.
So let's do a bit of a primer here, an educational piece. 'Cause I'm not even sure I know the origins of all the voting rights. But in the Constitution itself, the states have been delegated the authority to set up the voting systems, correct?
Yes and no. And actually, your broader point is very well taken. So I teach election law and policy at University of Texas Law School.
Okay.
And the first day of class, now I'm giving it away if anybody is going to take my class in the future, but the first day of class, I ask the students, I give them all a Constitution, I say, tell me where the Constitution protects the right to vote.
It doesn't.
And it doesn't. It's a trick question.
Okay. That much I know.
That much you know.
Okay.
And but it does. It does, and it doesn't. So what the Constitution does is it creates a structure, as I was saying before, that contemplates robust participation. And over the years, there have been more amendments dedicated to voting than to any other issue. And of course, we've had amendments over the years, famously after the Civil War, denying the abridgment of the right to vote. That's the exact language, on the basis of race or ethnicity. And then similarly for women, for anybody over 18, prohibition on the use of the poll tax, expanding to the direct election of senators. And so that's all ways that the Constitution
because most people don't realize that senators were not always voted
right.
for. That the state
That's
legislatures would decide who the senators were, right?
Okay. And even more fun fact, in the famous case Bush versus Gore in 2000, everybody kind of remembers the situation in Florida. In the Supreme Court case that followed, the headline, obviously, was that Bush became president.
Right.
But in that case, the court actually reminds us that we don't have a right to directly vote for president. That's what one of the things the Electoral College did. It tried to insulate the unruly masses. But I think a lot of people would be shocked to hear that. So going back to your question, what the Constitution does is it actually says that that states have the authority to run elections. However, it's subject to regulation by the federal government. And so one of the fancy ways you talk about this is preemption is the word.
Okay.
But the Supreme Court has found, and including reaffirming recently, that normally the federal government has a fair amount of leeway to preempt state laws, especially on certain topics. Okay. However, in voting, the federal government has a lot of leeway, and it has even more power because the Constitution has expressly granted that to the federal government. I'll note the reason for that is because our founders were very concerned that states would try to manipulate the federal system in one way or another to make themselves stronger. Our founders did not contemplate the type of national two-party system we have today. Instead, they thought that a conflict would break down at either the state or the regional level.
Okay. But I mean, it makes sense to me that each state can decide voting age, I guess, and other parameters, but they have to follow, as you say, certain federal components. I'm trying to simplify this. They've been preempted, so to speak. You can do it a certain way if you want, but here's certain things you can't do no matter what you want to do.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So what are some of those things states aren't supposed to be able to do?
So
one is discriminate on the basis of race.
Right.
Okay.
So I named a couple of them that are constitutional. And again, kind of the key about what the Constitution says is rather than affirmatively giving us a right to vote, it really gives us a right to equality in voting. So it's not so much that the Supreme Court reminded us, for instance, that you and I have a standalone free-floating right to vote for president. We actually don't. But I have the same right that you do since the Constitution has been amended.
So we may not have the right, but if you're going to have the right, then I get the right.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And then on top of that, there have been a number of really important laws passed over the years that regulate the states. The big one is the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965. And that did a couple of really important things. One, it directly went after Jim Crow laws and dismantled that regime.
Let's do a subplot to the primer here. What's a Jim Crow law?
That's a great question. So it is.
I think I know the answer, but I'm asking the question.
No. It is kind of it's almost, slang is not the right word, but it's kind of a catch-all phrase for a number of devices that were used, especially by southern states, to keep primarily African Americans from voting. But honestly, many times it would keep poor white people from voting. In a place like Texas, it definitely was also used against Mexican Americans as well. And these are things
so you might have to pay a tax, which we can't do anymore. You might have to pass a test.
A literacy test.
We have to do all sorts of things. So you have the right to vote, but you kind of have to go jump through some hoops to get to vote.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So Part of the Jim Crow stuff.
That's right. And so a lot of those, what are sometimes called
Why do they call it Jim Crow?
first-generation problems.
What's the Jim Crow part come
I
from?
don't actually know. I'll have to look that up.
Right.
Maybe
One
of your viewers can tell us.
One of your students has never asked you that?
No.
But if they do, you can say, that's a great question. Why don't you come back to class next time and tell us the answer?
That's a great question. What the Voting Rights Act also did is it had two really important affirmative protections. So part of it was kind of backwards looking. You can't do this, that, or the other anymore. And then two things were affirmative looking. One, there was something called Section 2, and this gave new enforcement power to the government and to private litigants if a law was passed that had the effect of taking political power away from a racial group. I'll get back to that. And then also there was something called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This is what's most often talked about. This basically punished states that had a history of racial discrimination in voting and said, you know what, because you have such a bad track record, Alabama, before you make any more voting changes, you have to get permission from the federal government.
Yeah, Justice Department, was it?
Yeah. And so this was an extraordinary law.
Talk about preemption.
That's right. I mean, I have a hard time thinking of another law like it, but it was extraordinarily effective in slowing down the manipulation that was occurring, because there were civil rights acts passed in the 50s, for instance, but the lawmakers in the states, they just figured out some new tactic to get around it.
Right.
And this stopped everything and put a thumb on the status quo. Fast forward a little bit. 1993 was another big marker for voting rights. That is when Congress passed something called the National Voter Registration Act, sometimes called the Motor Voter Law. This is the law that we're litigating under when we are going to Texas agencies and saying, you have an obligation to register me to vote when I'm getting a driver's license and you're not doing it properly. This is still a very important law. I'll note, and I know we want to talk about the Ohio voter purge case.
Right.
That case involves an interpretation of this law.
Correct.
Fast forward a little bit, again, after the 2000 election debacle, there was a law called the Help America Vote Act. The thrust of that was improving the technology of our elections. Fairly successful, although now it has gotten outdated because that was in 2002, quite a while ago.
Right.
And that is, in general, I'm skipping over a lot, but, the general arc of this history is making voting easier, cutting back on barriers, in the case of the 2000 law, modernizing and making things more secure. This changed in 2010 and then in 2013. Two important things happened. In 2010, there was a wave election. Republicans, as you noted, had some sort of unprecedented trifecta win across the country. And had kind of extraordinary power at the state level. And made, in my view, a very cynical calculation as a party, and again, this is not every single person, but there was clearly some coordination that they were going to use the newfound power to try to make voting and voter registration more difficult. The purported rationale was to fight voter fraud. However, there has been no evidence then or now that that was a problem. The result, though, has been a lot of new laws. Photo ID gets a lot of billing, but also restrictions on voter registration, cutbacks on early voting, that then made voting, not just made voting and voter registration more difficult, but made it more difficult after a fairly long time of generally expanding the franchise. On top of that, in 2013, the Supreme Court then struck down that piece in the Shelby County case, struck down that piece of the voting rights case. And so, one of the upsides of this is that in the last 5 years or so, we've kind of been in the wild, wild west of voting rights. There's been a lot of movement in this area, and you've seen a lot of litigation, and then including this Ohio case that was just decided by the Supreme Court.
And what you talk about historically at the time is President Obama was elected in 2008. As you said, it was a significant wave election,
Thereafter, in
2010.
2010, yeah.
It wasn't just a federal wave. I think if
That's
I'm
right.
correct about this, during President Obama's term, his party lost more seats
Yep.
across the country at all levels than any president
Yep.
ever lost.
He famously called it a shellacking.
The shellacking, okay, but
Yeah.
during the shellacking, we now have trifecta states and municipalities and other jurisdictions where people are trying to decide, hey, how do I stay in office?
That's
Can
right.
I tweak a law here in a way that will help me stay in office?
That's right.
Now, I know the Republicans have done this during that wave sequence, but again, since I'm beyond cynical and have no
Yeah.
use for either party, I'd like to suggest that if the
Yeah,
Democrats
sure.
were similarly
Yeah.
situated, my home state is Illinois.
Right.
That's as blue as the Mediterranean, I like
Yeah.
to say. And believe me, if there's a way to tweak it to their advantage, it's
Look,
being done in
I
Illinois.
I personally don't necessarily disagree with that. It's just the reality of that. That was the party that happened to win.
No,
big.
no, I
Yeah.
understand. I understand. But
Yeah.
that's how I balance it out, though. I
That's
know
right.
the
That's right.
Republicans may be seen as the ones who are pushing the envelope now, but it's not to say that if it was
Absolutely.
reversed, it wouldn't happen totally the other way around.
That's absolutely, and it's one of the reasons, honestly, that this is an area, and maybe I'm just justifying my own existence, but I do think this is one of the reasons it's so important to have the courts to be developing constitutional
Right.
protections and to be developing the protections under federal law, because you're right, at the end of the day, and as we talked about before the show began, if there's one thing that's true about being in power is people like to stay in power.
Right. And I note, and I think I'm right about this, you talked about the constitutional amendments, but you talked about important laws that have passed, Voting Rights Act and the Voter Act of 92 or
Yep,
whatever.
yep.
Most of those have passed Congress with a fairly significant majority. They have
Yeah.
not been one-sided votes like
That's
we're
right.
getting now on tax reform or
That's
Obamacare,
right.
whatever.
Yeah.
The Congress actually, there was a time when they got together and said,
Right.
yeah, let's fix this, and they
That's right.
figured out how to fix it. We can't do that stuff anymore.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I'm glad you raised this point, because it's one of the things that makes me probably, most depressed about the state of our politics, because voting rights, but even more than voting rights, voting administration, the types of things I'm talking about, the rules around, how do you register to vote? How do you keep the polls updated? What do you have to show in order to vote? How do you run an election? Until 2008, 10, and definitely before the 2000 election, these issues were not politicized.
Correct.
And you did have hearty support on both sides of the aisle for just making our elections run better. And I submit that that's absolutely the way it should be, because again, this is what our entire country is founded on, this process being healthy.
Right. So let's go back to where the
Yep.
debate is. So you do have people have been elected, they want to stay in office, and they want to tweak the laws. I mean, it's not as if you just wake up one day and say, okay, we're going to pass a law to make it impossible to vote. They've
That's
got to find clever ways to do this, right?
That's
They've got to
right.
find some standards. And as you said, the debate usually goes from the other side saying, we're trying to avoid fraud, right? We're trying to keep people from the polls who shouldn't be at the polls. And President Trump talks all the time
That's
about
right.
fraud at the polls. I'm not here to say they're being disingenuous, but that's the pushback.
Right.
We're
That's right.
protecting the integrity
right.
of the system. So how do these arguments play out in court? What is the court looking at to determine,
Yep.
is this really protecting fraud or not? Or is this really going to the heart of people should be able to vote?
Yep, that's right.
And maybe that's what played out in Ohio. So give us a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit about the give and take of that tension.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it, because the courts really have actually approached it as a give and take, or more specifically, a balancing test. And so what the court says if you come to the court under the 14th Amendment for one of these claims, and this is what we've seen play out most recently in a lot of these photo ID cases, is it is an absolute balancing test between your right to vote on the one hand and the government's interest in the particular law. And on that particular issue, the courts have actually been pretty clear that having a draconian photo ID law, and this is, I'm not actually, I want to be very specific about that, because I'm not talking about every single ID law or every law that requires that you prove.
Well, the point
who
is,
you
in most
are.
cases, to be able to register
Yes.
to vote, there is some form of ID.
Yeah, of course.
needed.
It's built into the entire system.
But the question
Yeah.
is,
And
has the
you're
type of
checked
ID,
against government
right? Has the type of
databases.
ID that's being
Yes.
asked for
That's right.
being created in such a way that it's hard to get that, and because it's hard to get it, then it's hard to get to
That's
register
right.
to vote.
That's right. And in addition, whether the types of IDs required are inequitable in some way. So in Texas, for instance, our law allows concealed handgun license, but not an ID from the University of Texas. And it doesn't take a demographer to understand the demographic difference between those two populations.
Right.
So you're right. The courts looked at those questions when it's trying to analyze what is the burden on voting. And on the other side, it's looked at evidence of, we all agree that the government has an interest in preventing fraud. So what they really ask is this law well situated to actually do that? And in the case of photo ID, the courts over and over have said, for the most part, no, these laws aren't actually very well crafted to do that,
Right.
and they've been compromised. Why don't we go? I know that we're going to run short on time.
No, we've
in a
already run
second.
short on time.
Oh no!
We're already run short on
We'll
time.
have to do it again.
We're going to do it again. Okay, I have you on the record.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right. That's
because
right.
we do Skype.
Oh, good. I
Okay,
was
do
going to
they
say.
have Skype in Texas, y'all?
We have Skype in Texas, although I wouldn't mind an excuse to get back to Aspen.
All right, we'll do both. Well, you've been a great guest.
Thank you so much.
And I think the law professor in you came out today.
I
thank you.
hope not too much, but thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's show. As always, we try to educate and we try and find solutions. We didn't get to some of the solutions today, but we have one of the nation's leading experts on voting rights and a law professor to boot. So hopefully you took good notes. Maybe we should post a test on the TV show website and see how everybody did today.
Thank you.
Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.